Hi, and welcome to this video. A video that fits very well into the end of the year or the start of the new year, because we will have a look at the top web development trends you gotta be aware of and you gotta follow in 2019. I already did such a video for 2018 at the beginning of 2018, and therefore in this video I will first of all have a look at my predictions I made there and see how I did regarding them. And thereafter, I'll have a look at my highly subjective list of top web development trends 2019. These were my predictions at the end of last year. And if you're only interested in my top trends for this year, you can jump ahead to the minute mark you'll see up there somewhere. So that were my predictions last year. And let's review them now. How did I do regarding these predictions? Were these really trends, or were there some things which didn't really become important? Let's have a look at the basics first. Last year, I stated, or at the beginning of this year actually, I stated that learning and knowing the basics of web development would be super important. And some of you didn't agree there. I got some opinions where people basically told me, well, that is not a trend. Knowing the basics, how is that a trend? I see where you are coming from, but I still stick to my opinion there. Knowing the basics is a trend because it's so important for all the other trends we got. Knowing the basics is actually something which often is kind of overlooked. It's easy to get started with a framework like Angular or like Express for Node without knowing JavaScript in depth or without knowing a lot about JavaScript. It's easy to start web development and build websites without knowing CSS. And is that bad? Not per se, but it certainly makes you a better web developer if you know these basics. You don't have to be a CSS expert, you don't have to be a JavaScript expert depending on what you're doing, but you should know the basics. So yes, I kind of was right there, but I also see where you are coming from if you don't see this as a trend. Now, certainly a trend is and was Node.js. Node.js is super important. We can do so much with it. Obviously, we can use it on the server side to write web applications with JavaScript, but we also use it in build tools. Webpack, in the end, uses Node.js. We use it in a lot of serverless solutions like AWS Lambda, where we can choose Node.js as a language. So it is super important, and learning Node.js is never a bad idea. And if you want to learn it, by the way, just as many other topics you see here in this video, I got a course on that, a very complete, high-rated course. And you find links with great discounts to all my courses in the video description. I'd love to welcome you there. Now, back to these trends though. Node.js, always worth learning. You won't regret that. Frontend frameworks was another trend I identified. And I'd argue I was right. Frontend frameworks like Angular or React with tools like React Router and Redux are super important. The majority of modern web applications, and with that I mean rich user interfaces we can work with, is built or are built with such frameworks. And actually not just web apps we can identify as such, also mobile apps using some hybrid approaches or tools like React Native, or desktop apps using Electron. These all, or a lot of them actually, use such frameworks behind the scenes. So these frameworks certainly are super important in the future, and they were in 2018. Diving into them, always a great idea too, therefore. Now, I also identified web components, and especially compilers like Stencil, which allow you to write vanilla JavaScript web components in an easier way as a trend. By the way, if you want to dive into web components and learn more about that, I launched a brand new course on this exciting technology, which essentially allows you to create your own custom HTML elements. Now, in 2018, web components became way more popular, and most importantly, browser support for them became much better. They are now definitely production ready, ready to use, ready to learn, and building your own custom HTML elements is such an exciting thing because you can drop these elements into any web application you're building, into any user interface, and you don't depend on any framework. You can easily share your web components across projects. So that is a great addition to learning a front-end framework, which gives you way more than just the components. But these components built with tools like Stencil, are highly reusable. And it's no wonder that modern UI libraries like Ionic use Stencil to build web components and not rely on a single framework, because this enhances reusability. So definitely a great trend for the future. In this year, 2018, it became more popular, but you could still get through web development without knowing that. In the future, I'm not so sure, but we'll come back to the trends later. Static web pages. Another trend I identified, because creating websites as static web pages yields a lot of benefits regarding search engine optimization, speed of delivery, ease of hosting, and so on. And therefore, I still believe into this, and it is very popular. Definitely didn't skyrocket in 2018, but on the other hand, tools or technologies like Gatsby.js, which is a static site generator using React.js, actually became way more popular in 2018, and the team behind Gatsby.js turned that open source hobby project into a real company, and that gives a lot of hope for this becoming even more important. But in 2018, probably was not the biggest trend, but also growing a lot. Progressive web apps. Well, that definitely is an ongoing trend and was super important in 2018, or became more important. It's heavily pushed by Google, but other companies like Apple are joining the hype train. Apple added support for progressive web app features in their latest versions of Safari and iOS, and that means that we now can use progressive web app features on the two most important platforms, Android and iOS. And therefore, if you had any doubt regarding progressive web apps, well, since this year, they are a real thing you should explore, you should consider for using in your next project. But the cool thing is, you can add these features to any project. It's not a framework you have to use. You don't have to write code or change code. You can just dump some of the progressive web app features into your existing application. Serverless. Serverless definitely is a hyped word and definitely something that is surging in popularity. There are serverless services by every major cloud provider, and new services are launched all the time. AWS launched new exciting services this year, or enhanced their existing services, and so did Microsoft Azure or the Google Cloud. Firebase added Firebase Cloud functions and enhanced their capabilities throughout the year. Serverless is a thing. It's a real thing because it adds real benefits. It makes it much easier to host code in the cloud and run it on demand upon certain events. And in our highly event-driven modern web development world, where we handle events all the time, no matter if we're building an e-commerce page or if we're building a blog, in such times we're living right now, having such an event-driven, code-on-demand, low-price, easy-to-host solution is a no-brainer. It became way more popular in 2018, growing strongly, used by many companies, and I believe that this will continue. Now, regarding AI and bots, well, that also is very hyped. It's a buzzword, machine learning. We see it everywhere, and that continued in 2018. And in 2018, we got tools that made it more accessible, that made it easier for us as developers to incorporate machine learning features. There now are machine learning libraries for JavaScript that allow us to add some machine learning logic in our JavaScript-driven applications, though these are still limited in terms of performance or what we can do there realistically without slowing down our page too much. But I believe that this will continue, and the direction of development we saw this year is very interesting. And it definitely means this is an ongoing thing and it's becoming easier and easier to add. So it was definitely worth watching this in 2018. It will probably also be worth watching it in 2019. But that already is something I wanted to add later in this video, right? I wanted to talk about my top development trends 2019 later, or actually right now. And no worries, these will not be the same as in 2018. So let's dive into the top development trends 2019 then. The first trend there, you can beat me now, again are the basics. But there's one difference. I added Node.js to these basics. Now, obviously, and that is in general very important, web development is such a broad topic that of course not every web developer needs to learn Node.js. But having a look at it, understanding the basics about Node.js is definitely worth it for every web developer, because it's not just one solution, one alternative to PHP. It also powers a lot of build workflows. It can be used in serverless environments. It can be used with some machine learning for JavaScript libraries. Knowing Node.js, in my opinion, is becoming more and more of a basic rather than an alternative to PHP or ASP.NET or whatever you might be using. And you can stick to these other solutions. It's just worth knowing the basics about Node.js. And the same goes for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you want to be a web developer, you gotta know these basics. And I will stick to this opinion. And it is a trend. It is becoming more and more important. Definitely take this seriously and definitely dive into these basics and lay solid foundations there. Now, since Node.js moved in there, we got an empty spot in trend number 2, at least if you looked at my 2018 trends. And there, I see GraphQL as a large trend. Some of you commented under my last 2018 video why this is missing. And the reason is, 2018 was an important year for GraphQL, but it was still picking up speed, it was still picking up growth. Well, now in my opinion, it's fully there. It's a great way of building stateless, client-independent APIs with high flexibility, and therefore, this high flexibility part is the interesting part. Therefore, we have an interesting alternative to REST APIs, and it's now easier to learn than it ever was before. There now are courses. I cover it in my Node.js Complete Guide. I cover it in a YouTube series I started a couple of days ago. I also can only recommend to dive into the kind of official docs on graphql.org, which are really great, very organized, and giving you a great entry, especially when combined with some courses or with my YouTube series. So learning GraphQL is now really easy, and it wasn't necessarily a year ago. It's now easy, it becomes clearer why we want to use it, the benefits are real, and using it has never been easier. In my opinion, this is a top trend for 2019. Now, my trend number 3, and by the way, I don't necessarily order these trends by importance, just as they came into my mind, kind of. The trend number 3 still are the front-end frameworks. And why wouldn't they? They were super important in 2018, and they will continue to be important in 2019. If we have a look at the NPM stats, we see a solid growth in all these frameworks. If we have a look at Stack Overflow surveys, we see that they're very important there too, that a lot of developers are using them. And people are using these frameworks for a good reason. They make our work easier, and they will continue to do so, especially since solutions like Ionic, which allows us to build cross-platform applications, allows us to build mobile apps with web technologies, or solutions like NativeScript or React Native, or Electron to build desktop apps. These solutions are all growing rapidly, and therefore, since they often use these frameworks because you still have to build a complex user interface, which then is simply wrapped into a desktop or mobile view, since you have to do that, using such a framework is a large plus because these frameworks make building complex interfaces way easier. Now, trend number 4 for me still are web components and compilers like Stencil. In my review of 2018 at the beginning of this video, I already mentioned that 2018 was a very important year, with browser support becoming way better for native web components. And in case you don't know what web components are custom HTML elements. You create them with vanilla JavaScript and you can drop them into any web application, no matter which framework you are using there, or maybe you're not using any framework. You can use them anywhere. And because you can use them anywhere, and because you can build complex widgets like a modal or a side drawer with a custom element, because you can do that and you can then reuse that across projects, because of that, their popularity will skyrocket, in my opinion. They're such a useful feature, and frameworks like Ionic are switching to web components only because of that high reusability. Therefore, web components are there to stay and there to become way more important in 2019. Now is the time to learn them. And if you want to learn them, I launched a brand new course a couple of days ago. Definitely check that course out if you want. And in general, check the video description to find a lot of great learning materials for all these trends. All my courses are listed there too, with high discounts granted to you. So web components, definitely a thing to keep in your mind, definitely a thing to consider. Trend number 5 is the Jamstack. And that is what I previously had under static web pages. The Jamstack in the end builds up or is following the idea of having a static web page for all the advantages a static web page yields. Search engine optimization is really easy, speed, hosting is easy, and mostly is also cheap. So static web pages have a lot of advantages, and we can generate them with JavaScript. And that includes frameworks like React, maybe with static site generators like Gatsby. And then we have an API, maybe built in a serverless way. Can also be a GraphQL API or a traditional REST API. And then we use markdown files typically for our blog posts, our product descriptions. And we have a build workflow. Tools like Gatsby make that easy, which allows us to basically read these markdown files and convert that to HTML code, which is then packed into that generated static page. And that is a highly interesting way of creating web pages. You save the need for a content management system there, which can save you costs and complexity. And you have a very lightweight, easy to host, highly optimized for search engines way of creating web pages. So definitely something to dive into, and if you are interested, you can also find helpful links for that in the video description, of course. I will probably also create some content on this in the near future, of course. Now, trend number 6 are hybrid apps. I mentioned that when I talked about the frameworks, the front-end frameworks already. We're now able to build mobile apps with the web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and we're able to build desktop apps thanks to tools like Electron for desktop apps or Ionic, NativeScript, React Native for mobile apps. And all these approaches have different concepts, and I can only recommend my comparison video for Ionic versus React Native versus NativeScript versus Flutter to learn more about that. You find it in the video description too. So we have different concepts, but the core idea is the same. We use technologies we know, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, to build applications that run as native apps on mobile devices and that also, if we need it, run as web pages in web browsers. And that saves us a lot of time and resources, and we can reuse our knowledge. This was very important in 2018, and it will become more important in 2019, in my opinion, because of the ease of use and because of the increasing importance of saving resources and reusing that knowledge, and because the web platform and the features offered in browser-side JavaScript and so on become more and more advanced. So there is more and more stuff we can do with these native web technologies. Now, another item, trend number 7, that I had on my 2018 trends list too, are serverless applications, or is the serverless world. Serverless does not mean that you're not using any servers. It means you're not seeing the servers anymore. You're not configuring them. I'm talking about services like AWS Lambda, but a lot of connected servers like API Gateway, AppSync. And it's not just AWS who has such services. You find them on other cloud providers like Azure or Google Cloud as well. Now, the idea here is that you have your code and you deploy that code in the cloud. You don't necessarily deploy a whole application, but you have a function in the cloud that holds your code that executes upon certain events which you define. And since we have a lot of event-driven applications these days, consider an online shop where people can order stuff and you want to do something when they order, this perfectly fits the requirements of such applications. And the advantage of the serverless approach then is that we save cost, because we don't have a server running our application all the time, and hence we would pay all the time. Instead, we only pay when our code runs. We only pay for what we need. And that was a great selling proposition in 2018, and it will continue to be one in 2019. And the amount of new services launched by cloud providers like AWS and the large increase in courses and tutorials and discussions on Stack Overflow, things like the serverless framework and how it evolves over time, all that is a clear indication that people are loving the serverless approach, and they're not going to stop because it's such a cost-efficient and easy way of hosting your code in the cloud. And why would we not want to save money in 2019 and have an easy way of getting our application into the cloud? Now, last but not least, we have AI and bots, and I had this on the 2018 list too. Now, this is a buzzword, obviously. Machine learning is a buzzword. It's everywhere. And it's everywhere, and still no one uses it because it's hard to use. It's hard to add machine learning to your own applications. It's relatively easy to get started playing around with it in some demo applications, which is nice and which is a good start, but it's still hard to implement it. Now, we got a broad variety of cloud providers, again like AWS, who are launching more and more services that we can add to our applications relatively easy to do classic tasks like image recognition or transcriptions, translations. And that means with that getting more accessible, it will become more important as well. And it will become more important to be able to use such services to enhance the user experiences of your users. This does not necessarily mean that you have to become a machine learning expert, but it also won't hurt to dive into the basics there and understand how machine learning works, what it means and what it does. And therefore, this will continue to be important in 2019 because machine learning will stay important. It will become more and more important. We have more and more data than ever before, and this enables us to do awesome things with that data. It allows us to predict better things for our customers, to solve their problems automatically, to handle large amounts of uploaded data, say images, without having to be afraid that a lot of junk gets uploaded to our servers. And all that requires machine learning. So it was important in 2018 and it will stay important in 2019 because of the massive amounts of data, because of the possibilities we have with it, and because of the improved accessibility or the improved ease of use of machine learning. There still is room for improvement, definitely, but following this closely and therefore being able to take opportunities early definitely is not a bad idea. So that were my top trends. Now, there is way more in the web development world that you could talk about, of course. For example, Python. What about Python? Well, Python is super important, but not necessarily for web development. If we talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence, absolutely, dive into Python, learn Python. And we got videos on this channel to get you started with Python. Python is definitely an important language to know the basics about, at least, and to be able to use in machine learning contexts. For web development, maybe not so much. You can use it on the server side, of course, but it's just one alternative there, not a must. No. What about things like testing, unit testing, end-to-end testing, or tools like Webpack or Babel? And what about optimizations like coding best practices or image optimizations? That are also general terms I always recommend diving in and learning. It's not a single topic. Testing will probably always be important because it offers real advantages. But you can also build great applications without it. You just probably have to spend more time on testing manually. Tooling, Webpack and so on. Well, we have a lot of CLIs these days that do work for us, so you probably don't need to know all the ins and outs about it, but it doesn't hurt to know that. So you already see we're getting really into a nitty-gritty detail level here. And therefore, I try to cover the bigger trends and not so much the things you can learn that will help you for sure, but more the things I recommend keeping an eye on. That is the idea behind these major trends I presented. Now, last but not least, what about PHP, Ember, Laravel, Angular 1, Bootstrap, Ruby? These are not dead. You can still use them. They're, in my opinion, and I had that exact same slide last year, in my opinion, they're just not the hottest thing to get into right now. But that does not mean that you shouldn't use them. Absolutely not. Laravel is a great framework. It's awesome and it's growing. Definitely. And definitely hot if you're a PHP developer. Just in the general things of you have to know it, I'm not sure if PHP or Laravel is something you have to know, but people will obviously disagree with me and that is fine. And that concludes the video. Please share your thoughts. Let me know what you think about this list. What are your trends? What is your opinion on my trends here? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I'm really excited to see your opinions there, and I hope you like this video. Hopefully see you in other videos too. Bye.